Very good evening to everyone and a warm welcome to the session on From Master Planning to Strategic Planning. I should also say good morning and good afternoon since we have one panelist from the United States and one from Europe. So thank you for taking the time to join us. Today's session, I'm delighted to invite very interesting panelists today. I will start with Mr. Ravichandar, who is a good friend of WRI. He calls himself as a civic evangelist, but we also know him as a person who has chaired many committees. He's been on the Bangalore Agenda Task Force. He's been on the BBMP Restructuring Committee, which was restructuring the Municipal Corporation of Bangalore. He has some footprints in the JNURM conceptualization of the mission. And other than his pro bono urban issues work, he's also non-executive chairman of Feedback Consulting. Thank you, Ravi, for joining us. I'll now introduce Mr. Jagan Shah. Mr. Jagan Shah is Senior Resident Fellow of IDFC Institute. WRI knows him better as the former Director of the National Institute of Urban Affairs, where he helmed a premier think tank across various issues of resilience, smart city development, e-governance, etc. We've had the opportunity to interact in the corridors of power in the Ministry of Urban Affairs when we worked on the Global Housing Technology Challenge, where he was a key contributor to its thinking. Thank you, Jagan, for joining us today. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Champaka Rajagopal. She's an independent practitioner in the urban policy planning space. She's also a faculty at Azim Premji University and at Sciences Po in Paris. She's also my ex-boss. So that's from our old consulting careers, where she was the head of urban development at Aegis Private Limited, which is a French company. She has experience in large-scale public sector projects such as the Mumbai Master Plan, Bangalore Master Plan, RMP 2015, and several other projects. Thank you for joining us, Champaka. I'd like to now introduce Mr. Hiren Daftada. He is the Deputy Chief Planner at the Municipal Corporation of Greater Mumbai, where he has been for over 30 years. He has the unenviable task of managing one of the densest cities in India and the world, one of the tallest cities as well, coastal city, sort of right there in the middle of so many climate vulnerabilities. So I've also had the privilege of working with him during the master plan process of Mumbai when we were doing the Mumbai Master Plan for 2034. Thank you, Mr. Daftar, for joining us. Next, I'll introduce Mr. Rohit Agarwal, Rohit Agarwal as he's known better. Thank you for joining us so early in the morning from New York, I believe. We haven't worked together, but we're very happy to have you here today because Rohit is one of the people who led Plan NYC. This was a strategic plan for the city of New York. He worked very closely, I believe, with Mr. Mayor Bloomberg on this plan. Otherwise, he's senior fellow at Cornell Tech in New York, which develops technology products to make cities better. He's also associated with various organizations such as Sidewalk Labs, Columbia University, and C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group. Thank you, Rohit, for joining us today. The final panelist is my colleague, Rajia Vanderburgh. He is the Global Director for Urban Development at WRI. Prior to joining WRI, he worked with the UN, in fact, with the UN Habitat's Urban Lab, which he helped found in 2014. He has led global teams working on a range of sectors. At WRI too, he heads work across strategic planning, urban resilience, housing, finance. And we look forward to his experience, including from the UN, where he's worked across several countries, several cities, and several partners in the urban space. Thank you, Roger, for joining us. I will initiate the discussion today by sharing a few slides. I just have 3 slides. I'm just going to share it. This will help set the context of planning in India and why is it that we really need to look at sort of the problem of planning and how do we solve it. So this is my presentation. I just have 3 slides. So here is what master plans look like in India. One second, let me just minimize that. Yeah, this is what master plans look like in India. This is the case of Bangalore. As you can see, it's a city of 10 million. Hubli, Dharwad, and Mysore are plans of 1 million cities. In many ways, it's just a land use color allocation. It's residential, commercial, industrial, what you see as red, blue, green, yellow. This is allocated irrespective of size and complexity of cities. And this kind of a planning process is very generalized. It leaves out a lot of specificities and needs on ground. We have the issue of sectoral agencies, parastatals who come in terms of, say, public transport, water, infrastructure, electricity. All of these are parastatal departments. They're governed by their own acts and plans, their own implementation schedules, and they don't necessarily interact with the spatial plan of the city like the master plan. Very often the master plan just accepts the proposals of these various departments and somehow tries to manage the land use around it. Master plans are more violated than followed. We have rates of about 20% to 30% implementation rates at the maximum in our cities. Why is planning, planning without implementation is futile. So, why are we still sticking to this process? This is the Delhi master plan that came out recently, just a month ago. As you can see, again, a splash of colors. You will never guess that one of the largest networks of metro rail in the world runs through Delhi. It's the 5th largest network in the world, but you don't really see it in the plan. It's again a sort of a splash of colors of red, blue, green, yellow. How do we change this? This is one of the reasons why master planning remains outdated. It rests in legislation that is outdated and weak. Town and country planning acts in India have typically not undergone these acts, like for example, the 1915 Bombay Town Planning Act, was created at a time when cities were not as complex as today, and such large metropolitan cities were not yet imagined. We have empowered parastatals making their own decisions. Micro level planning, which is sort of your ward level planning and neighborhood level planning, completely missing, very, very rarely done in some cities. Planning also is sort of a product. It's a once in 10-year or 20-year product. The master plan of Delhi gets revised once in 20 years. The master plan of Bangalore gets revised once in 10 years. How do we overcome this? We're using legislation, which is, like I said, legacy of the British, but they themselves have moved on from this kind of a planning. Legislation in the UK has moved on to do strategic spatial planning. They've had many acts like the UK Town Planning Act of 1990, the Greater London Authority Act of 99, the Localism Act of 2011, giving a lot of autonomy to the city through its mayor, of course, in these contexts. And you can see the Greater London Authority plan is a strategic plan anchored by the Mayor of London. It's not just a spatial plan. Along with spatial strategy is a transport strategy, an economic strategy, and an environmental strategy. The mayor is also mandated by the Act to ensure that all strategies are consistent with each other. You cannot just put a transport and an economic plan together without them sort of intersecting with each other, integrating with each other. They also have to be consistent with national priorities and their goals of sort of internationally remaining competitive and other obligations. The plan is also sort of a mandate for ward levels or the boroughs to then follow and do local area planning. So this is how planning that we have followed over decades. They themselves have moved on a long time ago. So how do we get there? To understand this, I will call upon two colleagues. This is an example of the Spatial Development Plan of London. You can see it's a unique diagram. It fits the city of London and no other city in the world. It's meant for London and its advantages and challenges. How do they set up sort of economic plans? How do they set up projects to trigger economic growth and livability? We'll understand this better from our colleague, Mr. Rohit Agarwal. And after Rohit, I will request Rajia to come and share his experience as well. Rohit will talk about Plan NYC in New York and a few other things. He will decide on that. And Rajia will talk to us about Johannesburg and how South Africa transformed its planning process. Over to you, Rohit, and then Rajia.
All right, thanks very much. And it's a great pleasure to be here this morning. I'll share my screen. And as Rajit said, I had the privilege of being involved in two strategic spatial planning efforts here in New York from very different perspectives. And I thought what I would do quickly today is share a couple, some observations on those and a couple of lessons that I learned. So the two in question, as was said, one was Plan YC, which started in 2006, was actually released in 2007. I was in the role of Director of Long-Term Planning and Sustainability for New York City. So that was an official role within the Mayor's Office of New York. And the fourth regional plan. Some of you may be aware of the Regional Plan Association of New York, which is about to celebrate its centennial. It's been around for 100 years and is a nonprofit entity and focuses regionally. And so, and I was chair of the fourth regional plan effort. So I worked very closely with the staff and had the opportunity to guide a lot of the thinking that went into that. Sorry, I skipped the slide. So these two plans had very similar goals, but from very different perspectives. And I think one observation overall is that what one can really accomplish with a strategic spatial plan depends on where one sits and what powers one has, and you should design your plan with your power very much in mind. And so here with Plan YC, it was an official strategy for the mayor. The mayor of New York is a very powerful role, has many of the city's executive functions under his direct control, and has, generally speaking, a relatively weaker legislative body. And so that what the mayor wants, even legislatively, often happens. We did this through a massive interagency effort because of that direct control. Basically, most of the key agencies were directed by the mayor to cooperate with us, but we also had a strong external advisory board. We focused only on New York City, and we did that strategically. New York City itself is only about 40% of the region's population. But of course, there's a certain amount of jealousy that the suburbs around New York don't generally want to be told how to be by the mayor that they didn't elect. And so we were very cautious not to opine on what happened outside of the city, even though, of course, from a metropolitan perspective, that's really important. The key themes were around accommodating expected growth, maintaining quality of life, and preparing for climate change. It was, of course, one of the earliest efforts at a major city having an aggressive climate action plan. And that also shaped a lot of what we did. It was in the context of moving urban growth. Of course, that's another key component. And we accomplished this plan in only 10 months, which is among the hardest I've ever worked in my life, but nonetheless, we got it done. The RPA plan was somewhat different. It's an NGO. It's traditionally established, or rather traditionally identified with the establishment. The RPA traditionally works very closely with the real estate industry, works very closely with the people in power, not generally believed to be a grassroots organization. For this one, we actually did an unprecedented outreach and partnership strategy with other NGOs, many of whom were much more grassroots in orientation, many of whom were directly and intentionally representative of underrepresented groups. So we achieved diversity and perspective. And of course, it's a regional focus that covers the entire metro area. But of course, an NGO has no direct power. Our four key themes are here: equity, prosperity, health, and sustainability. By 2017, climate change and equity were well-established issues in planning, although health was not yet quite as established. The context, the city had continued to boom, but the suburbs had stagnated then, a little bit reversed now by the pandemic, but not entirely. And this one took a lot longer to accomplish. Each had major successes and failures. For Plan YC, because of that tremendous amount of executive authority, basically everything that New York City controlled directly, we got done. We reinvented 7 major parks. We planted 1 million trees. We did major changes to the building code, which in New York City is under local jurisdiction, not state or national jurisdiction. We replaced a power plant. We abolished dirty heating oil to have a significant improvement in New York City's winter air quality, and a number of other things, including virtually all of the major rezonings that were planned during the Bloomberg administration were adopted. What's not listed here even, and I think related to spatial planning, was that local effort where we did a lot of neighborhood focused planning efforts around individual neighborhood plazas. And basically the failures were where New York City was not in control. Congestion pricing for Manhattan, something we've been trying to get for a very long time, has to be allowed by the state of New York, not by the city. So we lost at the state level. Only some of our transit investments were funded because our transit system is run by the state and not the city. We tried to require hybrid taxi cabs, and that was blocked at the Supreme Court because of federal preemption. The other thing that we did wrong was actually that we didn't realize the size of the task. We had housing targets that we met, but in retrospect, New York City was so much more popular than even we had expected that housing prices continued to rise. And while we did a good job of getting climate resilience planning underway, we were late to that game. And Hurricane Sandy flooded New York only a couple of years later, at which point very few actual changes had been achieved. Sorry, the fourth regional plan is much more recent, so we've only got a couple of years of experience. We did get congestion pricing. It'll be implemented in a couple of years. We influenced a number of things. But really the message here is that where we had clear allies in place and where the idea was not entirely new, we've succeeded in a relatively short period of time. Where we've been proposing big new ideas, they haven't taken root thus far. But one of the regional plan association's key theories of change is that these are 10 and 20-year ideas. They are not short-term ideas. And that's a key difference. And so one of my lessons from the plans is things depend on the power you have. If you are in a position of power, that should be a very different plan than if your power is only persuasion. If you have power, you should be including a lot of quick wins and incremental steps. You can command attention and action every day, and small wins build momentum and eventually create meaningful change. By having that goal of planting 1 million trees, we literally every day could put out an announcement that we had planted 5,000 trees that day, right? And it was great to maintain momentum. Ensuring that we have external validators who are signed up to support us was really important. And allocating budgets was critical, because if you have an executive power and you have money and you do not allocate money to your plan the day you release your plan, nobody will believe that you are serious about your plan. And then finally, we did an annual update. We put in the plan, here's the timeline by which each thing is going to be done. And every year we put out a report saying, here's what we've accomplished and whether we're on target or behind. If you only have influence, and this is the case of the NGO, it may be the case of certain underpowered municipal authorities or others, focus on a few very important ideas, because you can only command attention around a couple of big ideas if you're in that position. Ensure that you have lots of allies. Your job here is to have created consensus before your plan comes out. You should still use updates, but it's the power of shaming that really you're employing there. And one of the things I've seen is that you have to ensure that for each of your ideas, you have someone, a partner NGO, and an ambitious politician, a government agency who is going to make it their top priority. All of the things that RPA has achieved from its plan thus far is because either RPA made it their top priority for a whole year at one point, or there was a partner organization that was similarly focused. Some other things are universal. Of course, back up your analysis with data and don't make assumptions. We made some mistakes early on that happily we did the analysis. For example, in New York City, when the population was growing, we initially imagined we'd need a whole lot of new schools. But actually, because the US population is aging, it turns out we didn't need anywhere near as many schools as a straight line population growth analysis would indicate. So it's really good that we did that much more detailed analysis. Drive to the root causes, and this is one of these points about, I think, what's different about a strategic spatial plan. The root causes of spatial problems are not always about space allocation. They're often about institutions, they're about transportation, they're about other things. And a good strategic spatial plan will recognize that often the spatial allocation comes after and as a result of. The corollary is whenever you identify a need or an issue, make sure you know who has the power to fix it or prevent it from being fixed. Quantify your objectives. Something Mayor Bloomberg always said was what you can't manage, what you can't measure, you can't manage. And you can't underinvest in communications. That was one thing I learned. I was ready to put out a report in black and white and line drawings. Happily, smarter people overruled me because having something beautiful is actually really important. And then finally, one of my favorite comments, and I'm having trouble here. Oh, shoot. There we go. is that remembering that the best plan is the one that actually has impact. And to a certain extent, consistent with your theory of change, you've got to decide which battles you want to fight and which battles you don't want to fight. And ironically, when you have power, that may be the time to choose not to fight certain big battles. And it's been my perspective that with something like the Regional Plan Association, where exhortation and being ahead of the thinking is a good thing, that's an opportunity to take on even bigger ideas that may not take root for another 10 or 20 years, but they need to get out there somehow. So those are my observations from two major planning efforts in New York. Thank WRI for allowing me to be here, and thank you for your attention.
So I'll go ahead. Thanks, Rit, for this great presentation. I think quite a lot of things that you've been saying in the context of New York resonate with a completely different context that I'm going to explain. I want to focus, I'm very thankful to be part of this conversation because strategic planning has been kind of almost an obsession for me for a long time. So I could tell about all the things that I think are good and bad about strategic planning, or what is not strategic, but I thought to kind of, focus on one case. In this case, South Africa. I've been supporting Johannesburg and the South African government in different roles, earlier with UN Habitat in the spatial development framework for Johannesburg, and currently with WRI in really looking at cities at the engines of recovery. So a lot of kind of strategic challenges and following actually their reform process on how they go about strategic planning quite closely. So I want to shed some light on one hand on the Joburg strategic plan, and on the other one on the enabling conditions for that to succeed. So South Africa took on a huge challenge with the ambition to really change and reform urban development and to construct what they call a new deal for South African cities and towns. And that's because the spatial planning in South Africa has been for decades, of course, determined by apartheid planning, divisive planning, exclusive planning along racial lines. So there's a serious spatial construct that defines how people live, where they live, how they have access to services or not. So the idea to create a post-apartheid cities, to kind of think in a new way on how to restitch the city, has been kind of the that has been the kind of the key driver behind that reform process that's captured under the integrated urban development framework. And it looks at kind of 4 overarching goals and 9 priorities or policy levels. That whole overhaul of planning, of the way that cities plan in South Africa, is a long process. It was also kind of a process that was kind of very consultative, inclusive, bringing many partners on board in the discussion how we should, or how South Africa should rethink and replan their cities. But it also banked on a group of experts that really brought in, as Rit said, the data. What about demographics? How is it actually, what are actually the results of apartheid planning? How can we think about resilience and about risk management? So a combination of consultation of partners and kind of a rich input by research and data to shape a new idea about urban development planning in South Africa, which resulted, in another session today, Stephanie Chetty from the government of South Africa will go deeper in the actual integrated urban development framework. I just touched briefly on it. I will go to the city level quickly, but it resulted in a vision, really a vision on how you create much more kind of socially integrated urban structures and inclusive. And it has 4 strategic goals, and 2 are kind of very key to how this whole new approach is planning was operationalized. It's about spatial integration. How do we restitch the cities? How do we literally bring different people together? And how do we bring actually places where people live closer to where the jobs are? And the second, and that relates to inclusion and access. How do you create accessibility across the continuum of the metropolitan area? This is the governance structure. So how do you implement such an overhaul? And I'm not going to go deep into that, but I want to shed some light on the three red boxes that you see below on the screen, because the program, or the kind of the overhaul, provided three programs for three types of cities. A support program that sits in National Treasury, supporting 8 metro areas. A support program that sits at the Ministry of Cooperative Governments and Traditional Affairs, that caters for intermediate cities, and the third one, which is implemented by the South African Local Government Association on Small Towns. What I find very interesting and appealing is that at the national level, this idea of cities as a key for larger ambitions of the state. And secondly, a clear understanding that, and Rajit, you touched upon it, that cities are different. You have different approaches and different models and different needs for different sizes of cities. That is very well understood and being implemented with support programs and financial support through this kind of three types of cities. I think not unimportant is this whole, integrated urban development framework also catered for better coordinated donor coordination. So that's the kind of the enabling environment. Then on the spatial development framework of Johannesburg, and you see this very happy picture of me next to Park Stouw, visionary leader, mayor of Johannesburg at that moment. And he asked, when I was in UN Habitat, he said, can you make a much more strategic plan? Because if I read right now the plan for Johannesburg, I don't understand what I need to do or where I need to act upon. So can you make a more strategic plan that is that prioritizes a few key projects in order to implement this idea of the post-apartheid city? Therefore, we started the process, bringing in a lot of partners. And that's very important. And Rit already talked about the complexity between city and metro. You know, this process of bringing not only private sector partners and different departments within Joburg, but also making sure that the plan is kind of connected to the bigger metropolitan context. You know, the airport of Johannesburg is actually outside of Johannesburg. So the city is bigger than its boundaries. So it absolutely requires to look into that metropolitan space. Nevertheless, the spatial development framework itself didn't have a mandate to plan for the rest. So that process of bringing in partners is key. So what the spatial development framework was after is restitching the city, bringing jobs closer to the people. On the right side of the screen, you see in the red dots, that's where the jobs are, and in yellow where the people are. And this is very exemplary for many big cities at the moment, which kind of have developed and are developing much more as scrambled eggs than as a kind of more a city with a clear hierarchy. So it's really kind of a field condition. The other key part that the spatial development framework was after is create access to green and to make sure that, you know, key biodiversity areas would be protected in while facilitating growth. So what's the best thing, or let's say the biggest win of the strategic development framework, instead of doing everything through a consultative process, through a process with the different departments and a kind of research by design, bringing in different data sets, looking at different options, it kind of prioritized 5 strategic projects. And I think that's a big win. So 5 strategic projects around the metropolitan core renovation, the corridors of freedom, the transit-oriented development approach, Soweto, which houses 1 million people, which is a township, a southwestern township, and the renovation of the area. The corridor that connects Johannesburg to the airport, and the mining belt, which sits in the middle. You see it in the blue. It sits in the middle of Johannesburg and used to be the division between the rich north and the poor south. An industrial belt, you know, people that know Johannesburg know that Johannesburg grew because there's a lot of gold in the ground, and a mining belt kind of really, it was a a great barrier between the north and the south. So these are the 5 key projects that the local authorities would invest in and would promote. And then that leads to a zoning plan, but not a kind of meticulous zoning plan with all sorts of colors. 4 main colors: blue, focus on growth and investment; orange, focus on urban consolidation; green, focus on ecological resource protection; and gray, critical biodiversity areas. These are the 4 colors, or the 4 priority urban development projects. And it's quite interesting because it linked directly, there a clear link between capital investment priorities and the colors on this map is made. So you invest in blue and you consolidate in orange. So that's kind of the bigger thinking. So I want to say something and then I close on one of the strategic projects, the Corridors of Freedom. I think one of the big wins of this plan is to really rethink the city through accessibility. So how do you restitch? How do you give people access to jobs? Most of the families, they spend the largest share of their monthly income on actually transport and the biggest time on a day on commuting. So it's a super big barrier to development. So the Corridors of Freedom, investing in bus rapid transport and then connecting it to urban development. And what is interesting about spatial development framework, it provides principles and incentives for local area frameworks to develop. So principles on density, but also incentives, for example, for inclusionary housing, making sure that private developers include share affordable and low cost housing in their plan. And then last but not least, as I said, the link between the actual plan and capital investment is key. So South Africa and Johannesburg is a sophisticated system in which the demand for allocation of resources in public works from the local level is filtered and aligned with the actual strategic priorities. So the demand for capital investments that align with the objectives of the spatial development framework will always be prioritized over others. So this is a way how you can kind of get a machine into place to support bottom-up developments around transport corridors in order to create and restitch that city and create what they call that bigger ambition of the corridor of freedom that give everyone the opportunity to make use of the opportunities that urban areas offer. So a couple of lessons learned, and this is the last slide. So really changing how you plan and strategically plan requires an enabling environment at the national level or the state level. At least that national urban development framework was really key into integrated urban development framework. That idea of looking closely at the different types of cities, you know, the metros versus the intermediary cities and towns. A spatial development framework in Johannesburg, looking at strategic project, making choices and having kind of a priority urban development framework. And then last but not least, you know, then align at the most local level, align priority precincts, principles, and the capital expenditure plan. So I think that sets the kind of the framework of how to go about strategic planning, learning from the South African context. This process has not been finished at all. Everybody here in the audience knows this is a kind of a long-term approach to how to change cities, but also how to think about cities as drivers of national change. And that right now, and that's the last thing, that right now offers the platform to implement a lot of ambitions related to climate, climate and related to actually national recovery. I stop with that. If you let me go, I'll go on because I love this topic. I'm very happy to and looking forward to being part of the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, both to Rit and Rajia, for the excellent presentations. Very clear takeaways in terms of, you know, long-term thinking, short-term actions, ensuring budgets are in place, because without the money allocated, you will not see any change on the ground. And of course, needing the intent to be in place as well. So thank you very much for both your presentations. We also have very clued in decision makers who are looking for alternate processes to where their cities are functioning. And I'll invite Minister Satyendra Jain, who is the Urban Development Minister of Delhi, to say a few words about this.
Delivering strategic projects that trigger urban transformation is critical for Delhi to overcome current and future challenges. We see strategic planning and projects as key tool to shape cities into more resilient and equitable spaces for all. Best wishes to WRI-India for successful Connect Karo conference.
Thank you very much, Ms. Jain. And we have leaders in the Indian context who are keen on creating change, bringing in that urban reform. But what are the ingredients required for that reform? And I will go first to my panelist, Mr. Ravichandran. Sir, you also call yourself the patron saint of lost causes. I remember all of them. So what is your view on sort of the opportunities and challenges of bringing in such planning reform in the Indian context? And what has been your experience?
Thanks, Rajit. Firstly, listening to both Rohit and Rajia's presentation, clearly it's a case of what it can be. So first, let me just focus on where we are currently. So we had, for instance, in the case of Bangalore, a restructuring committee where we looked at how the city needs to be reimagined and regoverned. And within that, what can we do in respect of the master planning process? Now, one of the first things, and this is let me give you the headline news. It's a report that's gathering dust, which is why I'm the patron saint of lost causes. But it has, I think, though I'm biased, nice ideas, which I'll come to. The first thing we need to understand is our current master planning process. Rajit set it out in terms of every 10 years, 20 years. They're very static. They don't work. I always use one statistic. Our 1995 Comprehensive Development Plan, it's neither comprehensive nor developmental, but anyway, we'll let that go, showed open spaces at about 25%. The latest master plan, which was supposed to come out in 2015 for 2031 and not yet published, shows the open spaces at 4%. So if any proof be required that our current process, as Rajit mentioned, of land use and development control regulations doesn't work, this one figure itself gives you a sense. Clearly, and because we worked closely with WRI and we had learnings from New York and London, clearly strategic spatial planning was the way to go to. But we run into a lot of obstacles in getting there. And one of them is really the spatial bit. In fact, this is just a shout out for tomorrow's session at 2 o'clock, where we are discussing the whole geospatial framework that's being discussed tomorrow. But most of our cities don't even have a central spatial center where information is available, which can be commonly used and shared. Each of our agencies have their own base map. So can you imagine Bangalore having multiple maps in different agencies of which they are working to do GIS? So that's one of our problems. The other problem really is, in the terms of the scale of plans, if I go back to what we had suggested deep decentralization down to the ward level and even the local area level as what is required. And at the same time, we suggested appropriate integration or re-centralization at the city-wide level. That was the essence of our report, a mix of deep decentralization and appropriate re-centralization at the city level. And consequently, the scale of plans we looked at is saying that we need ward level plans, we need zones which are a bunch of wards, then we need city level plans, which are a bunch of corporations that we had suggested, and we need a regional development plan. Now, all this sounds nice on paper, and that this would get coordinated by a central coordination committee at the apex level. But in reality, getting there has been very, very difficult. Today, for example, in a city like Bangalore, we have a 2031 plan which was supposed to have been announced in 2015, still lying in limbo somewhere. So that's really the ground reality. And since we are talking about strategic spatial, it really is the way to go for Indian cities. For one main reason, the leaders in the past, the state has a huge control on cities, and normally the state chief minister is the city development minister. Honestly speaking, it should appeal to them to choose maybe 10 or 15 strategic projects across the entire city of diverse characters. And given the dysfunctional setup that we have got in Indian cities, where you have a city corporation and you have multiple parastatal agencies that supply water, electricity, transportation and the like, actually the strategic spatial projects kind of thing can actually make all these multiple people come together. For example, if I want to set up a garment kind of area in North Bangalore, I can actually focus all agencies' attention from the point of view of bringing water, from transportation, housing needs, electricity. It's actually, you can knock heads together to bring these people together to make the garment park a success. And in the process of doing that, the associated hinterland would also improve, because you would bring the multiple agencies in a focused way to that particular geographic area for the garment park. It could be IT somewhere else, it could be a tourism thing in the inner city, whatever. So we saw the merits of doing that. We have put out reports, but has it gone anywhere? The answer is no. We can discuss subsequently what are the constraints in making this happen. But for now, what I'd like to say is, clearly strategic spatial plan is the way we need to go in Indian cities, but we are a long way from getting there. We are still sitting with outdated master planning process of land use and development control regulations which don't work. And any solution has to go in terms of how do we get to where the more developed countries have already reached. Rajit?
Thank you very much, Ravi. In fact, from the situation in Bangalore to the situation in Delhi across, to the north, I request Dr. Jagan Shah to come in here. Jagan, as you know, the recent Delhi Master Plan has also come out. It again follows sort of the legacy frameworks that we're seeing. So what is your sort of take on making this shift towards being more strategic in our planning and more effective and outcome oriented?
Thanks, Rajit. It's really a pleasure to be on this panel. There are so many people that one has crossed paths with in the past. I think, Rajit, everything that has been said about strategic planning in Indian cities, both by Rit as well as by Roger and by Mr. Ravichandran, all of it is true. In fact, everything we say about strategic planning is like making motherhood statements. It's all wonderful to have. But like Ravi said, how do you get that? How do you get there? And I just want to draw our attention to that. Let's start, for instance, by something that you said, which caught my attention, Rajit, that you said that neighborhood level planning is not taken account of. Actually, that's untrue. The master plan for Delhi, for instance, has local area plans which are meant to be created as a cascading level of planning right from the regional plan level. The master plan for Delhi actually fits in as a sub-regional plan for the regional plan. Through the zonal development plans to local area plans. But the error, and this is linked to what Rit said about power and influence, the error was that the Delhi Development Act makes the responsibility of making local area plans that of the municipal corporation, which is interesting because it's a very enlightened move when you look at legislation. But it simply never took place because the power struggles between state government, the central government, as well as the municipal corporations has never been able to align. And so you've got this complete mishmash. I think we shouldn't condemn the MPD 2041 yet. It is still a work in progress. It hasn't been finally notified. I'd like to mention that some of the heartening things that are going to happen in that plan is, one, that the infrastructure is going to be brought out of the appendices where it usually used to reside into the actual structural plan for the city. Secondly, it addresses land management issues. It addresses tenancy and tenure and these kinds of issues. And it addresses coordination. And I think coordination is the key point here. The other thing is, and here again, I echo what Ravi said, there are many reports that lie on the shelves. I was a team leader at NIUA in 2006 when we did a peer review of the Delhi Master Plan on behalf of the Ministry of Urban Development, which looked at the London Key Plan, which looked at the Plan NYC, exercise, and also pointed out what was then a rage, which was the Chongichong redevelopment in Seoul, which showed how area level planning could actually be done successfully. However, that report lies in the shelves of the Ministry of Urban Development. I mention this because I think we need to understand that we continue to struggle with the same issues over and over again. And therefore, this remains a pie in the sky that we should do strategic planning, but we don't have the wherewithal. And I want to mention two reasons why we don't have the wherewithal. One is what Rit said about data. Unless data is available at a granular level, unless the city is measuring itself, its metabolism, if I can use jargon, you can neither inform the public about how their city performs or how it affects their lives, nor do you inform the planner well enough to empower them to actually make effective, impactful planning. Ravi might remember when we were part of the India at 75 committee that we were pursuing the idea of data observatories. Now, that's something that the Ministry of Urban Development has also been promoting. But how do you get the state governments, which have the constitutional responsibility for managing cities, how do you get them to create data observatories? So the challenge of all of this in India is perhaps of a magnitude which we do need to take into account. And I want to just end with one last point, and that's about capacities. When we were asked by DDA at NIUA, when I was director there, and we secured the contract for making the master plan for Delhi 2041, we were acutely conscious of the fact that we don't have the capacities, not only within the institution, but also in the larger ecosystem to do what we would have liked to do, which is make all the local area plans on behalf of the municipal corporations, make it so that at least for once MPD 2041 has all local area plans done. I believe the team at NIUA is still pursuing that dream. I hope that it actually manifests itself, because clearly, even if we were to do the granular planning that we need to do, we may not have the capacity in our cities and across the country of the number of planners, urban designers, architects, and others that are required in order to do this at that granular level. I'll pause there. Thank you.
Thank you, Jagan. In fact, WRI itself is an anchor institute to the ministry for their macro level planning effort, which is on LAP and TPS, local area plans and town planning schemes. And despite, going through several town planning acts where the provision actually exists, it doesn't stop you from making a local area plan or a town planning scheme. These pieces of legislation lie dormant. So there are enablers, but as we were speaking, the implementation, the realization is really poor. I'd like to call on Mr. Hiren Daftardar, in many ways, the practitioner on this panel, working at MCGM in Mumbai. Sir, you've been part of the Mumbai Master Plan, one of the most difficult plans in the country to do. How do you react to this? How do you see even in a case like Mumbai, which is quite unique, where the municipal corporation is preparing the plan, unlike development authorities in other contexts, you still have challenges of several parastatals, say metro rail coming in, etc., many of which you have to accept the alignments of rather than negotiate with. How do you see strategic planning and the opportunities in our context in your city?
Just thank you. Am I audible? Thank you for giving me opportunity. So currently, Mumbai has a plan in place, which was started. The preparation started way beyond 2009. The plan was published in 2016, sanctioned in 2018. It is a typical plan. For earlier we had, this is the third development plan. We had a development plan in 67, 91, and this all were prepared in-house by municipal engineers. Only this time we had employed planners like you and Champaka for doing the plan. But for earlier two plans, all the plans were prepared by engineers. That is why I call them as a mathematical plan. A typical plan framework is forecast planning population scenario 2 years beyond, 20 years for the horizon period, calculate the amount of FSI, calculate the amount of city space required, public facilities, roads, stormwater drains, then where open spaces, calculate that, allocate wherever possible, and allocate the zoning for that, and finish off the plan. That is how the perfect planning process has gone in Mumbai for last 3 plans. In current plan, while we were doing this current plan, we had a lot of public outreach. Sampaka may be knowing that we had a lot of workshops for knowing the citizens' perception, public representatives' perception for 20 years Mumbai. So we were asking every time, how do you want Mumbai to be at say 2034? How do Mumbai should look like at 2034 horizon there? Because that was the horizon plan for Mumbai, or the development plan. So these were the common questions we were asking for this public outreach program. Luckily, the plan went through smoothly. The one plan we was cancelled. The second plan went very smoothly, because I think we had a very strong political support. For earlier plan, we didn't have any strong political support, but this time we had very strong political support. This is my perception, that because of that political support, we did the plan smoothly. There were no controversies. Like in Mumbai, every inch matters. There were no controversies like somebody's plot we have reserved for some strategic purposes, and we moved that reservation ultimately. So these type of controversies were not there. But because of that political support, we could complete the plan, and we have now started the implementation. Now coming back to this strategic planning, while preparing this plan, we had envisaged that every 5 years we'll be monitoring and evaluating the plan performance. And this, we know that for the earlier 2 plans, the implementation percentage was hardly from 20% to 40% plan was implemented. So this year, as soon as we published the plan, we started allocating funds for implementation of a development plan. So we had identified certain lands which were municipal land, government land. We started demanding those lands from government, from municipality, and we are now, every year we are allocating some money for implementation of a DP. This year only we had some less amount because of the COVID and all that. All the municipal proper money was spent for fighting COVID, building new temporary facilities for COVID hospitals. So this year only we had less. We had allocated around 500 crore for implementation of a DP for this year. But for last 4 years, we are allocating to the tune of 2,000 to 3,000 crores for implementation of a DP. For this, Mumbai land is privately owned land. So we have to acquire the land. And because of very high market prices, we have to pay 100, 2,000, 3,000 crores to a plot owner for taking his land for civic projects. So that is one problem we are facing. And another problem we are facing is people are not understanding the plan per se, because there is a different understanding for the public, different understanding to the politicians, and different understanding for municipal corporations. So that is why I think the strategic plan has to become. We have to have some strategic plan in Town Planning Act. It has to be built in Town Planning Act. Unless and until it is a part of any act, we will not be able to move towards from master planning exercise to the strategic planning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Daftar. Clearly, Mumbai, of course, a very unique context. Land price is equal to New York. You have several challenges to manage. I'd like to come to Champaka now. And Champaka, you worked on innumerable master plans in the Indian context. So you have sort of that pan-India perspective of how master planning works and doesn't work. What would your reactions be to strategic planning as presented today?
Champaka, you are not audible.
Yeah, you're muted, Champaka.
Thanks, Rajit. The 2 big plans that I have worked on, and one that I co-led, was the development plan for Mumbai, along with the Municipal Corporation for Greater Mumbai, and a whole host of experts that were established on that team as well. But today I felt, having listened to both the presentations, brilliant presentations, I thought it would be important for me to reflect on a couple of processes that were established previously in the Indian context of nationally sponsored scheme, as well as a few other aspects that are pertinent to specifically to projects as strategic instruments that you've rightly highlighted in your note. And thanks for that brief that you set out for all of us. So, I'd just like to reflect on one particular component of discussion that we've had from both the presentations with respect to capital investment and capital investment planning. And I'm sure both cities, New York and Johannesburg, have their own political contentions and planning processes. But at this moment, amongst all of us here today, is to reflect on the gaps that we have in the Indian context and what has worked elsewhere. So at Johannesburg, since I've had the opportunity briefly to work as part of the World Bank's team at Jakarta, this was with the City Planning Labs initiative with Dr. Gayatri Singh there. There was a brief opportunity to interact with the planning agency at Johannesburg. And what was really striking was how well the spatial development framework, as well as the spatial area framework, the SDF and the SAF, are intrinsically integrated with the capital investment planning process. And there are three key innovations that I'd really like to highlight over here. And please correct me if I'm wrong on some of the strategic highlights, but I believe these are the key important points. One, that budgetary allocations made by the city or made through grants received from the center or the province are spatially linked. So people can actually see exactly where the money is going. And those 5 strategic projects in Johannesburg are very much representative of how money and public or private finances are linked to spatial impact. That's one very important innovation. And I think there's of course a lot of resistance in our context, because transparency to that extent will bring about great levels of vulnerabilities out there in the public. And that's probably one of the biggest reasons why there's resistance to making this linkage between spatial priorities for introducing projects with the financial allocations. The second is that there are 4 steps, and each of these 4 steps involve fierce negotiations between agencies, which is led by the mayor's office. And the 4 stages are the delineation of projects, the project prioritization phase, which is of course a political process, budget fit, how much budget do we have, how does it meet with the requirements of the projects that have been delineated, and then devising alternative funding sources for projects that are facing scarce resources, right? So do we need to explore other kinds of financial instruments, fiscal instruments to enable generation of finances for executing these projects and to operate them. So the process is politically driven by the city government, by the mayor's office, and it is through a participatory process, and that's really important, I think. The third is that the CIP framework is meant to allow city governments to gradually build capacity to think medium to long term and plan to augment their fiscal and financial management capacities, while also forging partnerships with other organizations, other public organizations, private sector agencies, or the civil society, as the case for New York shows very well. And I'm emphasizing particularly on the capital investment planning framework and the mechanism and the need for institutionalizing this in our context, because this is not entirely new for us. And Mr. Ravichandran would have much more to say about this, but the Jawaharlal Nehru National Urban Renewal Mission did in fact aim to institutionalize such a process already. And through experience, many of us here can confirm that the JNNURM scheme greatly enhanced local government capacities to augment service delivery, even though many of the mandatory reforms, quite naturally, did not all neatly fall in place. So while the struggle to garner political acceptance of local area planning is equally important for us in the context of Indian cities to bring back the agenda of institutionalizing capital investment planning processes. And I'm emphasizing this again and again because it's not going to be entirely new. We've experimented with this in the past with specific agendas to to use the capital investment planning framework as a means to introduce or induce the implementation of many of the mandatory reforms that the 74th Constitutional Amendment Act sets in place. I'll stop over there, Rajit.
Thank you very much, Champaka. Many points resonating with what Rohit Agarwal also presented. So I'll go to Rohit now, also because we have sort of moved into the pathways to, where do we want to go and how do we institute sort of long-term outcome-driven planning in some sense. Rohit, what would you say are some of the ingredients that are required to do strategic planning? Champaka's mentioned a few, such as ensuring capital investment. Unless those budgets are seen, unless they're spatially linked, and people can see where that money is going, it will not really result in anything on the ground. And we've seen, several examples of how things don't happen. Would it also require, say, for example, an active citizenry or a more mature citizenry who know they can participate in city processes and budget allocations, etc.? What would you say are some of the underlying ingredients required to go through with a successful plan such as this?
Well, I think, I mean, all of these comments resonate, and Champaka, even more than the capital allocation, the recognition that strategic planning is fundamentally political in nature resonates with me very deeply, right? And because I think there is a tendency among planners and urbanists and architects to be technocrats, when in fact, bringing all of this together is a fundamentally political effort, right? And thinking that we're going to super professionalize it actually leads to failure. So I'd say that's one, which involves an active citizenry, but I'm not convinced that every New Yorker or every Mumbaiker has to have felt like they participated in a plan for it to resonate. It just has to resonate, which is what politicians that are successful, figure out how to say things or how to tap into an issue or tap into a preference, right, that resonates with people, even if they haven't actually gone out and talked to everybody, right? So there's that political instinct. That is one. And then I think this point about capital allocation, again, I would make an argument that there is, and I think the Regional Plan Association example demonstrates it, that there is a way that entities without budget authority can influence it. Is it a replacement for central strategic planning? Definitely not. But can it fill in some of the gaps? I think it can, if it's done in that thoughtful way where you're shining a light on a limited number of needs and you're building consensus among realistically the elite. To a certain extent, RPA, we often think about the fact that even in a region of 20 million some odd people like we have here in New York, there are 20,000 people whose opinion fundamentally matters much more than anybody else's, right? It's just a fact of life. Those are the people in charge of government agencies, of large corporations, people with money, etc. It's the reality. If you can get a reasonable amount of consensus among those folks about what should happen, you can actually shape things. And then a final observation on something that's in the RPA's theory of change is the idea that if you put a fully formed thought out there and you built a certain amount of consensus around it among that elite, you actually set the stage for a politician to decide that this is a good idea for their purposes. You don't know who that person is going to be. You don't know when it's going to happen, but you've kind of laid out a number of tools that somebody with power can eventually pick up. And again, that speaks, I think, to the idea of packaging a handful of big initiatives, because no politician is going to take some very wonky set of technocratic ideas and somehow make it a campaign theme. But if it's a big piece of infrastructure or a big strategic change or a big reinvention of this district, like that can be something that somebody makes a signature and builds a political career out of. And RPA has had a significant track record of doing that, because it is in a similar way. I mean, one of the biggest problems New York City has faced forever is that our region is divided up among 3 state governments There has never been any official regional planning entity. And frankly, we don't think there could be because of the legal issues around how you would have to do that across 3 states. And so that's where the RPA fits in a power gap.
Thank you, Rin, for that insight. And I should take that to Jagan Shah here, because Jagan, you've been part of the process. You've seen how policies are made, how decisions are made at the center and at the state, being at NIUA. This question about, is it about sort of the capital investment plan really? Is it about, the political will, the decisions are taken at the political level or the technocratic level? Where would you stand in this? And for a context like India, which of these, sort of motors do we need to get running first, or in which succession?
Thanks, Rajit. Tough question to say, but I must admit that my interactions with planning in India is not only when I was at NIUA. Since 2004, at least, I've been involved from the JNURM city development planning exercise, in fact, providing capacity building and training as well for the purpose. My point about the capital investment point, much as, again, I love it, it's fantastic, but we must keep in mind that cities don't decide investment for themselves. In fact, most cities and very few state governments in this country even have a fiscal situation where cities have the ability to put in the capital investment into infrastructure, let alone anything else, right? So we must keep this in mind. As the Finance Commission has shown us, most of the money being spent in our state governments by the municipalities is being spent on salaries. It's not being spent on public works. So, which is why there is a dependence on the central government to constantly put in the fiscal stimulus that helps to build some of that new infrastructure. So in some fundamental sense, we should make the best of what we can with that stimulus money. And in some fundamental sense, what we as a polity tend to do is to squander those opportunities. We did that with JNURM. We've been doing it with a lot of the urban programs currently being implemented in the country. Unprecedented levels of money being spent on cities, and yet cities themselves don't want to take ownership of that money. So it's a very paradigmatic and odd situation. But to come back to a point which I think Rit said, I think the building of consensus can be done around specific, what I would refer to as anchoring issues, right? So to my understanding, mobility has become a key anchoring issue in a lot of cities in our country. People are alive to the point about mobility, which is linked to productivity, people's ability to do shorter commutes, to travel in a more safer, more comfortable way so that they can be more productive, in fact, be more healthy. This is a very important anchoring institute, and of course, anchoring issue, and WRI has done really a lot of work in bringing that about. So congratulations to WRI. The other is transit-oriented development. So build on the mobility as an anchoring issue, and then let people see that around mobility, a city can evolve into a new shape and form. So everybody needs to be alive to sort of city form per se. I think, and Rit helped us do this when we were devising the smart city mission. I think area-based planning, taking bite-sized chunks of cities in order to actually improve the infrastructure and the built form there, is a good strategy. It may be much maligned because of whatever politics there is around the smart cities mission. But having said that, it is a good strategy. It will hold us in good sway in the long term. My last 2 points are about green and blue infrastructure. I think the public today and the influencers that Rit was talking about, that top 20% of the influencing public, are alive to the need for cities to have green and blue infrastructure. This is linked to climate goals, but it's linked to people's health and well-being. And that's what worries people now, right? And I would lastly say that we need consensus around housing. It is ridiculous that 50% of the city is housing, and yet there is no discourse about housing in our country. We talk about the implementation of government schemes. We don't talk about housing as an issue, as a political issue, to use Rit's words again. And it's a hugely political issue because there are exclusions and denials built into the way in which housing provision has been done in this country, which is rendering our cities into battlefields where they don't need to be. So the idea of housing as infrastructure is something the government recognizes, but the larger polity is not yet understanding or giving enough importance to. Back to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Jagan. I'll take it to Ravi here. Ravi, you've heard the conversations. In fact, in the Bangalore situation, when you had the rare chance to look at restructuring a municipal corporation, you actually took some bold moves, which could also have been, which were also contested in the sense of, bringing the chief minister back at the city level to take city level decisions, sort of re-centralizing, where people say that if you bring the chief minister in, you can never him out. But your stance was he's in already. So we are way past sort of the 74th amendment. We're way past trying to figure out whether the mayor can come back and lead a city like in other contexts. We know that's a lot of water under the bridge now. You had looked at several options, including whether a minister for Bangalore. I mean, could you tell us a little more about thinking about it differently from established ways?
So one of the things really is we have a constitutional flaw at birth. The center state, the first tier and second tier got clearly defined. But when it came to the third tier, the word that was used was local bodies. And that is a price that we are paying for. And the 74th for cities doesn't work and still doesn't fix the problem. So I think we should cease being in denial that we have a concept of a city government. We don't have. So if I take a city like Bangalore, which is representative of many cities, the state calls the bulk of the shots. The mayor only gets to be called a worshipful mayor. There is nothing worth worshipping in the post of the mayor. So it is the state, and the earlier we realize that the state calls the shots, it is nice to say that we can roll back all the parastatal functions back to the city and manage it there. Not going to happen. Of course, there are places like Kerala where the mayor is more powerful, etc., but those are exceptions. So my sense really is, and that is what our report said, we said get the CM in and we go for a directly elected mayor over a 5-10 year process, because it's an admission of the ground reality that they call the shots. So we might as well evangelize the good ideas with the person who's calling the shots. So I'm really being more pragmatic than trying to be idealistic. So I really believe we need to go and focus our efforts there. Now, for example, Jagan mentioned about the various schemes. So whether you take Amrut or Smart City, it's another problem. Each of those schemes are in separate silos. They don't even get integrated with the plan of the city per se. So they just land up from somewhere with some funding and get done, and we don't even have that alignment. So I really believe that re-centralization is required, but we also believe, which is the technocratic answer, that we need to follow principles of the subsidiarity principle and activity mapping. So you decide what is best done at what level. For example, garbage handling is better decentralized and handled at the local level. Transport planning, clearly even at the regional level, even more than the city level. We need to get those things in place and accepted by the system, that these are things better done at the local area and these are things better done at the central area. Now, the problem when I say that we go to the state, the resident welfare associations we are noticing are increasingly becoming more active, and particularly in COVID times, we have found that the RWAs are active, but they need to cross one more bridge, which is happening slowly. Most of us in the middle class who are semi-activists or working with civil society, we are more comfortable dealing with bureaucrats. We are less comfortable dealing with the political system. So whether it be the corporator or the legislator, we need to increasingly engage with the political class for the changes that we need. And I think slowly the resident welfare associations are realizing that we need to engage more politically and not with the bureaucrats whom we feel comfortable with, is another thing that is required as part of the overall fix. So basically, and also one last quick point about what Jagan said, which I think is relevant on housing. I've been a great believer that the way forward is social rental housing on scale. And the government has absolutely no thinking in terms of how do we get to social renting on scale, because these new concepts of the 15-minute city or the 5-kilometer city, where 90% of our needs are within a smaller thing, will require social rental housing. So to come back, Rajit, to the question that you asked, I believe that we have to work with the state government. It's a pragmatic choice, because I don't think it's feasible to get into that truly empowered mayor, city government. That bus, I suspect, has left the station, is not going to come back. So I would engage with the state, and I would engage in the sense that within that system, the city corporation, we are very clear what they can deliver, and they are an empowered city corporation to do that. And we need to find ways to coordinate the various parastatals. The challenge for all of us in Indian cities is we need outcomes which are interagency dependent. Corporation and many agencies, we need outcome oriented thinking, and everything about our government is talking about multiple crores of finance projects and silos of implementation of those projects. So we really have to thread this needle across agencies to get outcomes, which is missing in our city space and city-state space. Now, it's a long journey, but I really think, as I think Rit mentioned and others mentioned, I would think large strategic projects will appeal to the people at the state level who control the city. And I think we have to entice that system through smart projects of that kind, geographically spread out, diverse in what it achieves. And that has to be the route. So we have to appeal to them in the sense of how that is going to be different, will make them look good, because there's this other notion that good governance and good projects don't necessarily get you re-elected based on some anecdotal data of the 2000-2002. I think we have moved on, and I think it could help if we actually worked on the system to get them to see the greater glory that they will get if they go down that route. It needs to be done in a non-threatening manner. It needs to be embraced by them. Some will be top-down implementation and some will be bottoms-up. In theory, we know what needs to be done. The challenge is to get it executed on the ground. Rajit?
Thank you, Ravi. I'll go to Hiren Darsa from here. As you know, sir, we've spoken about various aspects, whether political, budgetary, finding that core issue to lobby around. But from your point of view as a technocrat, you are the Deputy Chief Planner of the city of Mumbai. What will enable you to go about better strategic planning? Do you require sort of the backup of a Town Country Planning Act that is modified to give you the powers to move forward? What can really help you? Because in the situation you're in, it will be difficult to start figuring out, say political lobbying, people participation. It's a complex process to enter into. Would legislation be the route for you? Just a question.
Rajit, we have some kind of strategic planning inbuilt in Town Planning Act, like local area plan, that is there. We have a 1966 plan having a separate act section for local area plan. But no city in Maharashtra has tried that. I think the reason behind it that the procedure for following that local area plan is same like DP, like you publish a plan, suggestion, objection. Even for a smaller part of a locality, you have to go through all these processes. So that is why no one has tried that local area plan. Another thing is that whenever we make a plan, at least in Mumbai, I know we have, or other cities in major cities, like we publish a report. Always there is a report accompanied by a plan, like drawings, you can see the maps and the DC regulation. And whenever that plan gets sanctioned, what it gets sanctioned is only the plan, like maps and the regulation. No one looks on the report, because report says everything. how the plan is to be implemented, what are the ways, what is the budget allocation to be made, and how is this report. We had two reports, 2015 report and 2016 report, but both reports were not considered by anyone. No one looked at that report. I think we should have a support of legislation as well as bureaucrats, because in every state there is an urban development minister and urban development secretary who are actually a pillar of sanctioning the plans. So they should also be emphasized that, look, we have some report also, because that report has to be taken seriously, because in this report we have a chapter for monitoring and evaluation of a plan on our own, because I am part of that process and because I am part of that team which worked for the DP, and now I am in a role of a implementation of a DP. We as a small team, we are now concentrating on monitoring and evaluation aspects, because we know how we have prepared the plan, what have gone into the preparation of plan, how much hours we have spent on drawing the plans, discussing the plans with various other these stakeholders and all that. So we know what has gone that. So we are now focusing on monitoring and evaluation. So that is why we are now forming a team of, say, smaller team, like 10 people, who are basically focusing only on monitoring, gathering the data from various other implementing authority like MMRDA. Then we have in Mumbai, we have a lot of spatial planning authorities where we are not supposed to do any planning. That is also one aspect. That is a separate subject actually. But we have a lot of holes in our plan. Like BKC, there is no Mumbai plan. It is a separate plan. Now, Mumbai Port Trust, a biggest landowner in Mumbai, they are having their own separate plan. MHADA, they are approving authority for building proposals. So that these kind of things, there are, because of the act, they mandate that we can have a special planning authority. These planning authorities have come. Like that, we should have some support in our legislation for strategic planning also. Otherwise, every 20 years, every city will be making a plan. Every city will be revising that plan after 20 years. So that process has to stop, and we should have a smaller plan. Every 5 years, we should monitor, we should modify the plan. If required, we should gather the data. And the data, basically the data is major. Like I think Jagan said that data is most important. Unless and until we have a data, and data in open source. Now I have a data, but I cannot share with anyone because there are data limitations, because there are limitations of sharing. So that because if you have data in public domain, then even anyone can go through that data and give suggestions for monitoring and evaluating the plan. And the budgetary allocation, like budget for a city of Mumbai, the implementation of a DP cost around 14 lakh crore. If we put entire municipal budget even for implementing of DP, will be going to halfway. We will not be reaching 100%. So that budgetary allocation from state and central and strategic planning legislation are the need of the hour for successful implementation of a DP. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Datar. I'd like to go to Champaka here. Champaka, we're talking a lot about, in many ways, as different panelists have mentioned, we do have good plans in place. There is good intent. The writing is there. However, as Mr. Datar was saying, the challenge then comes in the implementation end of things, monitoring, evaluation, implementation. And as we're talking, a lot of it is also in strategic projects. How do you see projects, and you have done some work in contracting. So if we could hear very briefly from you, how do you see strategic projects translated through efficient contracts?
Sure, thank you, Rajit. Prior to sharing some of my own insights on contracts, I just also wanted to clarify my own position on institutionalization of a process such as the capital investment planning mechanism, for instance, that I spoke about earlier. there are examples of how cities in other countries in the global south have actually incrementally institutionalized this process, right? And in ways that are suited to cities at multiple scales of large cities, medium-sized cities, and also, of course, with respect to political resistance that comes around in each of these cities. So I just wanted to say that I'm definitely very cognizant of the fact that the process of institutionalizing something as strong as the CIP mechanism is, of course, very complex. And there are smaller steps through which it can be done. And since multiple other schemes, like Mr. Jagan Shah mentioned, there are several schemes that are nationally sponsored that have already initiated many such increments already. And I think there's definitely a rife ground over there to push that agenda forward. Building on also what Mr. Ravichandran was mentioning, that we do have a constitutional framework, but of course we know that we need to work around the existing ground realities and navigate the existing political motivations. So I think I just wanted to clarify my own position over there. To respond to your question, Rajat, yes, I think I'd like to go back to one particular problem that you've highlighted in your brief that you shared with all of us, that there's basically a huge problem about convergence amongst institutions, and that's been a perennial problem, right? And when I say institutional variety over here, I mean institutions that are mutually conflictual in nature in terms of the motivations they are driving. So for instance, public organizations are driven by their welfareist agendas as opposed to private sector firms that are basically backed by profit-making motivations. And if we're talking about large-scale projects, strategic projects, then of course, many of these projects will involve complex partnerships, public-private, civil society organizations, and these are all dissimilar organizations that are sort of put together to work with one another. So that gives rise to a very complex space over there, and they're all making decisions at multiple scales. We're not in the pre-existing era when delegation formed the basis of decision making. So I think scales at which decisions multiple scales at which decisions are taking place is also complexifying the context of project governance itself. And I'd like to take, knowing well that since the early part of 2000s, national governments as well as subnational governments in our context have increasingly mobilized large infrastructure projects as part of city development agendas. Whether they're integrated or not with spatial planning is a different discussion. But these have been dominant instruments for dealing with public problems. For example, both national state governments have been aggressively advancing mass transit in large metropolises, particularly to deal with the problem of congestion, for example, or deteriorating air quality and so on. And at the micro levels, at the local levels, we've had projects that are commissioned by municipal governments. These are much smaller projects, of course, and which are taken up between elections, but they're still projects that are taken up through specific gated contracts. And I'd like to draw our attention to one specific aspect of urban projects and risks that has typically not been discussed in strategic planning in India so far. This is the problem of gated contractual governance of projects. And now on public projects, contentious outcomes of rigidity and flexibility in contracts or in regulations has been amply discussed for more than 3 decades or more. I would like to highlight the problem of incomplete contracts. Microeconomists such as the Nobel laureate Oliver Hart has argued and demonstrated very well that it's not possible to write long-term complete contracts. And given that public projects involving partnerships between the government, the private sector, and other hybrid agencies has increasingly become mainstream, long-term public contracting is inevitable. Now, the issue is that incomplete contracts produce and reproduce the problem of residual control rights. Under conditions where contractual clauses do not exist, transacting parties, whether public or private, are not bound to behave in a mutually constitutive conduct that supports public interest. In the vacuum of contractual incompleteness, the relationship between transacting parties ceases to exist. So all contracting parties then tend to act in self-interest as opposed to public interest. That's a huge problem. So the result is prolonged disputes, even litigation, which often lead to inordinate project delays. They lead to disproportionate project cost escalations and a host of other financial crises and issues. Who bears this risk? These are often transferred back onto the public agency and finally onto the taxpayer. The private party is also not absolved of risks in this case. If you're looking at, large projects, public-private partnerships, and contracts that are sort of gated over there. So everyone loses in the bargain. The discussion on contentious outcomes of incomplete contracts is critical, I think. And I've written about this myself, in particularly with respect to transport infrastructure projects, which is available online. But I just want to highlight that while we're talking about these large-scale strategic projects, it's very critical for us to pay attention to the nature of contractual governance that plays out, because it's a complex set of incomplete contracts that tend to exacerbate risks for all parties involved, not just the public sector, but all parties involved. Yeah, over back to you, Rajia.
Thank you, Champaka. We're completely out of time now, but I will give the last word to Rajia, since he's been waiting. Rajia, is there any secret bullet, silver bullet for us? For example, if South Africa and Johannesburg managed such a huge transformation, did it take literally the president or the prime minister to effect that change? Could you give us the last word from your end and we'll close it? We have literally 1 minute.
Well, it's very kind of you, Rajit. I don't have to have the last word. Many things. There's no silver bullet. I mean, I think the whole conclusion of this conversation is that there's no silver bullet. And so I just wanted to one thing that resonates a lot is about the political nature of strategic projects and plans. That is one thing. It's a negotiation, and where's the mutual interest, there is the biggest opportunity. That requires that coalition building, gathering different groups of society, private sector, politicians, bureaucrats, academics behind this kind of transformative project is really key. So thinking very cleverly about the process, not because we like process and we don't like outcomes, no, because we like outcomes and we don't like unnecessary process. So cleverly think on how you shape this coalition of the willing, because as has been said, there is no one solution for resolving equity issues of climate, issue of kind of spatial complex. So where is that coalition of the willing? So that is really important. And I think then the second thing that so this is not a conclusion, this is just the second thing that resonates a lot is that where is the kind of the collective, or where is the opportunity to invest? Is it through the infrastructure program? Is it through the climate agenda? Or is it through resolving the housing crisis and you have the opportunity to direct and to drive a project through one of these entry points? So sorry, Rajit, no silver bullet at all. I think the panel was fantastic, really, resonating many of the issues related to strategic planning, and happy to join further conversations around it.
Thank you very much. And thank you to all the panelists for giving us your precious time. We've had a great conversation. We hope to note this down and send it to you all as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Thank you.